The thin crescent moon of November hung like a strand of silver thread above the razor-sharp spires of the city of Oakhaven. In the attic chamber of the Vance estate, the air was heavy with the scent of half-burned candle wax and the salty tang of night mist drifting through an open window. Elara Vance stood at the center of a symbolic circle drawn in midnight ink, a specially crafted pigment made from the ashes of forgotten memories. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a cold that seeped deep into her bones. A cold born not of the weather, but of the presence of unseen essences that did not belong to the mortal realm. She drew in a slow breath, feeling her chest rise and fall beneath her dark blue silk gown. Elara knew she was wagering everything. The Council of the Iron Veil watched every step taken by spirit callers, and if they discovered she was attempting to awaken a soul that had slept for more than a century, the reckoning would be absolute. But the knowledge of the eternal verse, the timeless poem, said to contain the secret of everlasting grace, lay in the hands of the one she was about to rouse. She needed it to salvage the crumbling reputation of House Vance, and to fill the hollow void that had long encircled her heart. Elara knelt, her knees pressing into the rough stone floor. She began to recite the incantation in an ancient tongue, her voice low and resonant, like stones rolling in the depths of a ravine. The midnight ink on the floor stirred, writhing like black serpents as it crept over her leather boots, seeped through the fabric, and touched her porcelain skin. A sharp sting shot up her spine. This was the mark of the covenant, the moon sigil. She bit her lip to suppress a sound, her ash-gray eyes fixed on the center of the circle, where the air was beginning to twist, forming a pitch-black rift suspended in midair. In the name of the moon that never sets, in the name of the vitality of the ancestors, I call upon you. Elara's voice rang out, cold and commanding despite her shortening breath. Julian Thorne, commander of the burning fields, step forth from the silence and accept my bond. The room fell into a silence so absolute she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then a frigid gust burst forth from the void, snuffing out every candle in the chamber. Only moonlight remained, pouring in through the window. Within the symbolic circle, a figure slowly took shape. First, heavy warrior's boots, then tarnished silver armor worn by time, and finally, a face with sharp features, as if carved from black marble. Julian Thorne stood there. He was no wandering wraith nor a translucent ghost. He was solid, oppressive, radiating a crushing presence that made the air itself difficult to breathe. His eyes storm-tossed sea blue bored into Elara's. She felt a sudden connection, as though an invisible thread had wrapped tightly around her essence, pulling her toward him. A young spirit caller, Julian said. His voice was low and rasped with the echo of dust and battle, vibrating through the room like a snapped cello string. Do you know what you have just awakened, Lady of House Vance? Elara rose, forcing her legs not to buckle. She stepped closer to the edge of the circle, stopping only a pace away from him. At this distance, she could feel the cold radiating from his form, a powerful, commanding chill. I know exactly who you are. You are the keeper of the key to the eternal verse, and by the law of the covenant beneath the moon, you now belong to me. Julian's lips curved into a smile devoid of warmth. He extended a hand that had once wielded a blade that conquered entire continents toward her. Elara did not retreat. She remained still as his fingers stopped just shy of her cheek, separated by mere millimeters. She could see every groove, every scratch on his armor. A moment of near contact, barred only by the invisible boundary between the living and the eternal. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a fleeting instant, she found herself yearning for that touch, even though it might have caused her to fade from existence. Belong to you? Julian repeated, his gaze darkening. This covenant is a trap, Elara. You believe you control me, but look at the mark on your own neck. Startled, Elara raised a hand to her collar. Her skin burned beneath her fingers. The moon sigil was no longer a static symbol. It pulsed in time with Julian's heart. A strange sensation seeped into her mind, a centuries-long loneliness, a quiet sorrow, and a fierce longing she had never known. These were not her emotions, they were his. The covenant had opened a two-way path, and Elara realized she had bound herself to a being whose will was far stronger than she had anticipated. The ritual is complete, she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "You cannot defy my command. Now, tell me where to find the first fragment of the map." Julian did not answer at once. His gaze drifted around the cramped attic, taking in the shelves of crumbling books and potion bottles. A flash of disdain crossed his eyes, quickly replaced by deep contemplation. He took a step forward, crossing the boundary of the symbolic circle without resistance. Elara stumbled back, shock flashing across her face. "That's impossible. The circle, you used midnight ink mixed with your own vital essence, didn't you?" Julian asked, his voice now lower, more haunting. "You forged a soul thread. I am not your servant, Elara. I am your shadow, and a shadow is not confined by a circle." He stood directly before her, tall and overwhelming. She caught the scent of pine forests and frozen snow clinging to him, the scent of an eternal winter. Her limbs began to numb. This was the first price of the Covenant. Whenever Julian took on a solid form, a part of her vitality would be shared to sustain him. Her lips went dry, and the warmth of the room vanished, replaced by a hollow chill. "You're stealing my warmth," Elara whispered, her vision blurring with exhaustion. Julian watched her, and for a brief instant, the cold mask on his face cracked. He reached out, intending to steady her as she swayed but stopped. He knew that if he touched her now, the Covenant would tighten, doubling the weight for them both. The yearning to feel the warmth of life burned in his eyes, but he forced himself to remain still. "That is the cost of the power you crave," he said, his voice carrying a painful trace of compassion. "You seek eternity, but to obtain it, you must learn to live as one of the departed." Elara steadied herself against the edge of the wooden table. Outside, the moonlight began to tint red, a sign of mystical flux. She knew she had little time before the Iron Veil's patrol passed through the district. She would have to conceal Julian, or at least transform him into something less conspicuous. "I will not retreat," she declared, her voice resolute despite her trembling body. "No matter the cost. Tomorrow, we begin our journey to the ancient library of Oakhaven. You will accompany me in the guise of a bodyguard." Julian was silent for a long moment. His gaze lingered on the sigil at her neck, glowing softly silver under the moon. A bodyguard? A humble title for a commander who once led 100,000 soldiers. "Very well, Elara Vance. I will go with you. But remember my warning. This covenant is not merely a chain, it is a mirror, and sooner or later, you will see what you truly desire reflected within it." He stepped back, his form dissolving into the shadows at Elara's feet. The biting cold eased, though the numbness in her fingers remained. Elara stood alone in the darkened room, her breath fogging the air. She raised a hand to the mark on her neck, now bearing not only magic, but the rhythm of a heart that had grown silent long ago. Suddenly, a sharp knock shattered the stillness of the night. "Lady Elara," a deep, authoritative voice sounded beyond the heavy wooden door. It was Malachi, High Inquisitor of the Iron Veil. "We have detected an unusual disturbance in this area. Would you mind if we conducted an inspection?" Elara's heart skipped a beat. She glanced down at the floor where traces of midnight ink had not yet fully faded. She looked to the darkness where Julian had vanished. Fear surged, but at the same time, a whisper brushed her ear, though no one stood there. "Do not fear," Julian's voice murmured within her mind, oddly warm. "Let me handle this." Elara drew a steadying breath, adjusted her collar to conceal the sigil, and stepped toward the door. She knew that from this moment on, her life would never again belong solely to herself. The Covenant had begun, and the spirals of fate awaited them beyond the door. As her hand closed around the brass doorknob, a jolt of energy shot through her palm, not from fear, but from the unmistakable sense that Julian stood just behind her, and seemed yet immensely powerful. She opened the door, meeting Malachi's scrutinizing gaze and the guards flanking him. "Good evening, Inquisitive," Elara said, a faint smile touching her lips. "What brings you to my humble room at such a late hour?" Malachi stepped inside, his eyes piercing the shadows. He paused at the very spot where Julian had stood moments before, inhaling deeply as if searching for a lingering scent. Elara held her breath, her hands clenched behind her back. She felt her shadow at her feet stretch unnaturally long, slowly creeping forward to curl around Malachi's boots with subtle precision. A secret had been born beneath the moon, and it was ready to devour anyone foolish enough to touch it. The light from the storm lantern in Malachi's hand cast sickly yellow streaks across the walls, thrashing and leaping like creatures desperate to escape captivity. The High Inquisitor moved with measured slowness, the iron soles of his boots striking the stone floor with a dry, ruthless cadence each step, like a hammer blow against the taut strings of Elara's nerves. He stopped before a portrait of House Vance's ancestors, yet his hawk-like gaze never left the darkest corners of the room. "This room smells unusual, Lady Elara," Malachi said, his voice smooth, but edged with the sharpened chill of a freshly honed blade. "Old candle wax, dust, and something else. Something like the scent of battlefields where the fires died long ago. Don't you notice it?" Elara clenched her hands behind the folds of her wide skirt. A current of electricity ran along her spine, not fear, but the pulse of the Covenant. Julian was there, hidden within her shadow stretching across the floor. She could feel his simmering fury, an unseen pressure that thickened the air itself. "Perhaps it is only the smell of ancient books my father left behind, Inquisitor," Elara replied, her tone unnervingly calm despite the storm inside her. "House Vance has always revered history, and history often carries the scent of dust and sand." Malachi turned, his gaze settling on the line of Elara's collar. Beneath the thin silk, the moon's sigil prickled with heat. Elara felt a terrifying shift. Sensation began to drain from her fingertips. When she brushed her bodice, she no longer felt the softness of silk, only a hollow, icy absence. The first debt was coming due. She was slowly losing her ability to feel the physical world in exchange for Julian's presence within it. "History is a fine teacher," Malachi said, stepping closer until less than 2 paces remained between them. "But also a terrible betrayer. Recently, the Order has received reports of dark magical disturbances from old graves. Some say someone is trying to awaken the Conqueror. What do you make of that?" Elara's heart tightened. The Conqueror was Julian Thorne's title. Before she could respond, sudden warmth wrapped around her numbing hand. Julian did not manifest, but he pushed his will through the Covenant. Cold confidence flooded her mind, shoving back the fear that threatened to ignite. "The Order is always sensitive to rumors," Elara said, her ash-gray eyes meeting Malachi's without flinching. "But if the Inquisitor wishes to hunt ghosts, perhaps you should search in places stained with sin, not in the chamber of a woman trying to preserve the last scraps of her family." Malachi narrowed his eyes. He lifted a hand, moving as if to touch Elara's cheek, an imitation of concern, but truly a test. The warmth of skin, the telltale sign of recent contact with spirits. Elara froze, breath caught in her throat. If he touched her, he would feel skin cold as a corpse. At that moment, a loud crash erupted near the window. An antique ceramic vase toppled from its shelf and shattered into 1,000 fragments. Malachi jerked around, his outstretched hand stopping mid-air. The shards did not simply fall. They seemed shoved by an invisible force. "It seems the night wind in Oakhaven is a bit stronger than is politely permitted." Elara seized the opening, her voice carrying a thin thread of mockery. Malachi said nothing. He stepped toward the wreckage and crouched to examine it. While his attention was elsewhere, Elara's shadow abruptly stretched, curling around the High Inquisitor's boots. It was no accidental protection, Julian was warning him. Elara felt Julian's savage hunger through the thread, a hunger to step from darkness and crush the man threatening her. "Don't, Julian," she whispered in her mind, hoping the soul thread would carry the message. "Not yet." The tension peaked as Malachi rose and fixed his narrowed gaze on the faint black stains Elara had failed to fully wipe from the floor. He approached, the iron toe of his boot tapping the blurred edge of the broken circle. Elara felt her heartbeat fuse with Julian's fast, strong, the commanding rhythm of a warrior. "Lady Elara," Malachi said, lowering his voice into a dangerous whisper, "I will leave you to your books tonight. But remember, Moonlight never keeps a secret forever. When the moon is full, every truth will be laid bare." He turned and left, gesturing for his guards to follow. When the last footstep faded down the corridor, Elara collapsed to the floor. Her entire body trembled, breath coming in frantic bursts. She lifted her hand pale, bloodless, and utterly numb. She tried to grip the table's edge, but her fingers slid through the wood, as if it were smoke. "Elara," a voice spoke beside her ear, and suddenly warmth returned. Julian emerged from the surrounding shadows, his form sharper than ever before. He knelt beside her, his deep blue eyes filled with the pained concern he tried to bury beneath his cold exterior. "Don't touch me," Elara whispered, though in her deepest core, she ached for him to hold her and drive away the emptiness as chill. "The Covenant. If we touch, it will collapse." Julian stopped his hand a finger's breadth from her shoulder. His fingers trembled in impossibility for a general who had never flinched before death. "I saw what he intended," Julian said, his voice dropping, murder in its undertow. "I should have killed him on the spot, and then both of us would be hunted to the ends of the world." Elara looked up at him, her face washed pale beneath the moon. "You are no longer a general of 100,000, Julian. You are my shadow, and I need you alive. In your way." Julian studied her, and for an instant, the barrier between summoner and spirit seemed to dissolve. Only two souls remained, bound together by a ruthless oath. He lifted his hand, not touching, but tracing the outline of her face through the air, as if memorizing every detail. It hurt more than a real touch, a restrained craving, a feeling sprouting from darkness and fed by sacrifice. "Foolish girl," he said, his voice softening into something dangerously gentle. "You chose a path with no escape, the knowledge of immortality you seek. It is not as beautiful as you imagine." "I don't need beauty," Elara answered, forcing steel back into her tone. "I need power so I never have to fear anyone again." She stood, though her legs still wavered. "Now tell me about the map fragment. Malachi suspects us. We must leave Oakhaven before the full moon." Julian rose with her, his tall presence swallowing the space around her. "The fragment is in the underground library of St. Jude's Church, but it is protected by seals that only the blood of one within the Covenant can open. Are you willing to bleed for it?" Elara stared at the mark on her neck in the mirror. It was no longer silver. It had darkened into the color of dried blood. "I have traded my soul. A little blood is nothing." She walked to the window and looked down on Oakhaven's shadowed streets. The Order was closing in, and the only being she could trust was a man who had been dead for a century. A bitter irony rose in her throat. She turned back to Julian, who stood half drowned in darkness, half painted by moonlight. For a moment, their eyes locked, and a surge of emotion hit Elara so hard she had to step back. The longing to belong, to be understood. Julian moved closer, his breath snow-scented cold brushing her forehead. She closed her eyes, savoring his presence even as it drained her senses away. "We leave at dawn," Elara said, her voice small but unbreakable. "I will always be behind you, Elara," Julian murmured, his form beginning to dissolve into her shadow once more. "Until the last moonlight dies." When the room was empty again, Elara realized she could no longer feel the warmth of the candle burning beside her hand. But in return, Julian's heartbeat still pulsed within her mind, steady as a countdown to their fate. The Covenant's consequence was not merely physical numbness. It was changing the way she perceived the world itself. The living people on the streets below now looked like faint ghosts, while Julian the dead man was the most vivid presence inside her, a terrifying inversion of nature. She reached for her black cloak, preparing for the morning's journey. But the instant her fingers touched the fabric, a small slip of paper fell to the floor, something Malachi must have dropped from his sleeve without noticing. Elara picked it up. A single line, written in red ink. "The Necromancer will be the final key. Do not kill her until the verse is deciphered." Elara's blood turned to ice. Malachi did not merely suspect. He knew. He was using her as a piece on the board to claim forbidden knowledge. A second betrayal revealed itself within the Covenant. She was not the hunter, she was the prey. Elara crushed the paper in her fist, her eyes igniting with a dark fire. "Julian," she called softly into the void. "I hear you." His reply came from the depths of the shadow at her feet. "We won't go to St. Jude," Elara said. "We go straight to the Whispering Ruins. If they want to play a game, I will show them how it ends." Julian's low laugh echoed through the room, approving. And no less tragic. The real war was only just beginning, and the price would be greater than anything Elara could imagine. The heavy footfalls of the Iron Veil guards thundered in the corridor like the drumbeat of a death march. Elara Vance stood in the attic chamber, trembling hands crushing Malachi's slip of paper. She had no time to stagger, no time to mourn the High Inquisitor's betrayal. Every passing second was another tightening ring of the trap. "We have to go now," Julian said. His form did not fully emerge. He melted into Elara's shadow, and under candlelight that black shape looked like a monster stretching awake. "The main entrance has been sealed," Elara whispered, her eyes sweeping the old stone walls. "But House Vance never builds a residence without an escape. There's a tunnel beneath the wine cellar. It leads straight into the eastern forest." She reached for a leather satchel containing only the most essential implements, a few vials of shadow ink, a fistful of dried silverleaf, and a silver-hilted dagger set with the cat's eye stone. The moment her fingers closed around the dagger, numbness surged again. She could see the blade's gleam, the delicate engravings on the hilt, yet she could no longer feel the metal-less sharp chill or the stone's rough edge. Her sense of touch was dissolving like fog before morning sun. Julian noticed her hesitation. Through the soul thread, a fragile tremor of weakness traveled from Elara to him. He slipped free of the shadow and formed beside her. This time, he wore no heavy armor, only a dark, wavering cloak, making him look like a piece of the night itself. "Don't be afraid," Julian said, his voice low and strangely steady. "I will be your hands until we're out." They left the room in silence, slipping through narrow side halls. Elara moved like a cat, even though she barely felt the floor beneath her feet. Through her link with Julian, it was as if he guided each step. Whenever she was about to catch a hem on rotting wood or misjudge a crooked stair, Julian's shadow tugged lightly at her skirt, or a faint, cold gust kissed her heel, a warning without words. Down in the wine cellar, the air turned damp and thick with the sour bite of forgotten barrels. Elara crossed to the corner where the largest cask stood. She heaved it aside, revealing a rusted iron trapdoor. "Help me," she panted. Julian stepped forward. He didn't need physical strength. He simply laid his pale, half-real hand over the iron ring. Black smoke unfurled, the rust screamed in a long metallic groan, and the door snapped open. A breath of air rose from below, smelling of wet soil and deep earth cold. They climbed into the tunnel. The passage was narrow and low, forcing Elara to duck. Julian followed close behind, his presence wrapping around her like a fragile shield, thin, but desperately necessary. In the thick dark, Elara felt herself slipping into another world, where moonlight could not reach, where there was only her and the soul of the conqueror. "Why did you agree to help me?" Elara asked softly, her words echoing against stone. "You were a great general. You could tear this covenant apart if you truly wanted to, couldn't you?" Julian was silent for a long time. Their footsteps kept a steady rhythm, calming in the claustrophobic dark. "You underestimate your bloodline's magic, Elara. The covenant beneath the moon is not an ordinary chain. It's a binding of fate. And besides," he paused, and something like regret brushed his tone, "you remind me of someone who wanted power so badly they forgot how to live. And what happened to that person?" "He became the one you just summoned," Julian replied, bitter irony cutting cleanly through the air. The tunnel ended at a small opening masked by thorny wild roses. Elara crawled out and inhaled the forest's crisp night air. The moon had climbed high, pale and cold. Not far away, torchlight flickered iron veil patrols moving along the tree line. They had to cross the forest to reach the whispering ruins. Elara felt her body begin to rebel. Exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. The ritual and the escape had drained too much. She pulled a dried apple slice from her satchel, hoping for a quick burst of strength. But the moment it touched her tongue, Elara froze. She chewed, yet there was no sweet edge, no tartness, no familiar fruit scent. The apple in her mouth was as tasteless as dry wood. No smell, no flavor. Horror rose in her throat. She spat it out, eyes wide, and looked at Julian. "What is it?" Julian moved closer, concern tightening his features. I can't taste anything," Elara whispered, her voice shaking. "Julian, my sense of taste, it's gone." Julian's gaze darkened. He had known it would come, but not so quickly. The price is escalating. Each time I use power to affect this world, opening the trapdoor, hiding your steps, it drains a part of your senses to compensate. Elara sank against the roots of an old tree, both hands covering her face. She couldn't feel the warmth of her own palms. Now, she couldn't taste life either. She was becoming a hollow vessel, a body turned into shelter for an ancient soul. "Keep moving," Julian said, yet this time, it wasn't an order. He extended his hand, his fingers stopping just shy of Elara's. He wanted to pull her up, to lend her strength, but he remembered the taboo. Direct contact could make everything worse. Elara looked up at him. Under the moon's washed-out light, Julian's face was beautiful in a mournful way. She saw the struggle in his eyes. A sentence nearly escaped her lips. "Hold me, just once." But she swallowed it. She knew that desire was poison. She pushed herself upright, brushing dust from her skirt, dust she could no longer feel. "I still have my eyes and ears. That's enough to keep going." They crossed the ancient forest, where twisted trees looked like pleading arms frozen mid-prayer. The deeper they went, the thicker the mist became. This was the domain of the Whispering Ruins, the remains of a fallen civilization, where the dead were said to linger in every stone's murmur. Julian stopped suddenly, lifting a hand for silence. Ahead came the faint sound of fabric sliding over dry leaves, and the soft clink of metal. An order patrol had camped near the ruins' entrance. "They got here first," Elara said, hatred sharpening her breath. "Malachi didn't lie. He's using me to open the way, but he prepared for this. I can handle them," Julian said. The darkness around him began to coil, shaping itself into the outline of a long sword. "No," Elara cut him off. "If you use too much magic now, I'll lose another sense. It could be my sight. I won't go blind before I even see the eternal verse." She searched the shadows for another route. Moonlight brushed a broken statue nearby, a headless goddess, her hands tipping a jar that poured carved streams of icy water. Elara remembered a detail from her father's notes about the rules governing these ruins. "Julian, look." She pointed to the stone base beneath the statue. A symbol was carved there, identical to the mark on Julian's hand. A crescent moon wrapped in chains. "You've been here before, haven't you? Before you died?" Julian approached, eyes narrowing as if he were trying to recover a memory scraped nearly clean by time. He placed his hand on the symbol. A pale blue light flared, illuminating a small circle of space. Whispers rose around them, not in human speech, but like wind screaming through narrow cracks in stone. "This is where I swore an oath," Julian murmured, his voice slipping. "I didn't come here to seek immortality. I came to save my army from a blood curse. And I failed." The collision with his past unraveled Julian's composure. Through the covenant, Elara felt raw agony slam into her, so intense, she buckled, breath tearing in and out. Something shifted between them. Julian was no longer only a cold general, and Elara no longer only an ambitious necromancer. They were simply two wounded souls leaning toward one another in a hostile world. "Julian, stop. It's killing us," Elara gasped. Julian yanked his hand away. The blue light snapped out. He dropped to his knees beside her, worry exposed on his face. "I'm sorry, Elara. That memory, it's too strong." He lifted a hand, and this time, he couldn't stop himself. His fingers brushed a strand of hair at her temple. It was the lightest touch through freezing air, but Elara felt electricity ripple through her entire body. She looked up, their breaths mingling in the moonlit mist. For one suspended moment, the world vanished. No order, no ruins, no covenant, only the fierce longing to erase this loneliness. Julian tried to speak, perhaps a promise, perhaps a confession, but a horn blasted from the Order's camp. Torchlight began to move toward them. "We have to go inside," Elara said, shoving the distraction back down into the depths of her mind. The hidden gate opens only when moonlight strikes the statuesque crown at the right angle. She stood, feeling her exhaustion ease, slightly fed by whatever that forbidden spark had awakened between them. They moved with the moon's shifting light. When the silver beam kissed the goddess's stone jar, a section of wall behind the statue ground open, revealing a narrow passage descending into the earth. They slipped inside just before the Order's guards could spot them. The stone door slammed shut, returning the forest to silence. Within the ruins, the air was dry, carrying the smell of time itself. Elara lit a candle. Its dull gold glow crawled over carved reliefs on the walls. She realized she could no longer smell the burning wax. 3 senses. Elara gave a small, bitter laugh. I'm becoming a ghost faster than I thought. Julian stood beside her, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Don't worry, Elara. I will be your nose, your ears, your hands so long as you keep your heart beating. They went deeper, toward the whispering ruin center. Elara didn't know what waited beyond, but she did know this. Each step forward was another piece of herself falling away. Immortality was close, yet its price looked more and more like the complete erasure of who she was. After a stretch of silent descent, Julian halted before a massive bronze door. There was no handle, only a small heart-shaped opening cut into the metal. This is the Covenant's second layer, Julian said, his voice turning grave. To go on, it won't ask for blood, it will demand your most precious memory as an offering. Are you willing? Elara stared at the door, then at Julian. Her most precious memory, and she realized, with a shock that felt like grief, that it wasn't her family or her ambition. It was the moment his fingers touched her hair beneath the moonlight. Would she surrender it? The fierce red glow of the relic in Malachi's hand, what he called the cinder heart, poured out a dry, scorching heat, a brutal contrast to the ruin's mournful cold. Elara felt the sigil on her neck spike with pain, as if thousands of heated needles were driving into her flesh. Julian, now only a dim shadow beside her, gave a low, strained sound. That red light seemed to be burning the soul thread that bound them. Malachi advanced, his iron boots grinding bone fragments and stone dust into the floor. His face so often composed, the mask of a man who claimed to enforce justice, now revealed a feverish ambition. Lady Elara, you're stepping into a game whose rules you don't understand, Malachi said, his voice echoing through the tight bronze corridor. This door doesn't merely demand a memory, it demands the sacrifice of identity. You will not be Elara Vance after you pass through. You will be an empty corpse, nothing but a vessel for an ancient soul. And what do you want? Elara snarled, forcing herself upright though her legs no longer belonged to sensation. What do you want the verse for? To cleanse this world, or to make yourself a new god? Malachi laughed, a smile that never reached his cold, sharp eyes. To keep this world orderly, someone must stand above both life and death. The iron veil has preserved balance for centuries with lies. Now, the truth needs a new master. He lifted the relic higher. The red radiance of the cinder heart began to spiral, forming an invisible pull aimed straight at Julian. Julian fought to hold his shape, but the black smoke around him was being siphoned into the relic. His pain surged through the Covenant, crushing Elara's chest as if a fist had closed around her ribs. Julian, she cried, her hand flinging out into the air without thinking. Julian looked at her, his storm blue eyes already dimming. Don't, Elara, don't let him. Take. Elara knew she had seconds to choose. If she let Malachi continue, Julian would be imprisoned inside that relic forever, and she would become the Order's puppet. The only way out was the bronze door in front of them, the door Malachi could not open himself, because he was not bound by the Covenant beneath the moon. Elara turned to the heart-shaped opening in the bronze. A strange compulsion rose from somewhere deep beneath thought. The door seemed to whisper, coaxing her to offer herself the most precious memory. She closed her eyes. Images rose in her mind like slow-spun film. Her late father smiling as he placed her first spellbook in her hands. Her mother humming lullabies through Oakhaven's bitter winters. Those memories were everything, proof of who she was, proof of what she was fighting for. Then another image pushed through. A brief, devastating moment. Julian's gaze as his fingers brushed her hair beneath the moon. The ache of wanting, the soul-deep connection between two abandoned beings. It was the only memory that had made her feel truly alive in years. I won't give you the verse, Elara said, and her voice became terrifyingly calm. And I won't give you Julian. She pressed her palm into the heart-shaped opening. At once, tiny bronze tendrils shot out from inside the door and sank into her hand. Elara did not feel pain, she had already lost touch, but she felt an awful siphoning, as if a machine were draining the sap of her soul. Silver light exploded from the bronze, pushing back Malachi's red glare. The High Inquisitor screamed in rage as the magical recoil hurled him backward. Julian felt the pressure of the cinder heart loosen. He surged toward Elara, his form thickening into something storm dark and violently real. He wanted to stop her, to tell her the price was too high. His shadowed hands closed over her trapped ones, still unable to touch her flesh. But in that instant, their bond rose to a level it had never reached before. He could not touch her skin. He could touch her soul. Elara, stop. You'll forget yourself. Julian roared inside her mind. But Elara didn't hear him. She was sinking into a white, empty vastness. She saw her father's face blur. His warnings, his warmth, the stern tenderness in his eyes, everything unraveled into smoke. She tried to hold on, but every shard of family memory was swallowed by the bronze door like water vanishing into desert sand. And then the strangest shift occurred. The grief of losing them was replaced by a cold, clean emptiness. Yet in that emptiness, Julian's presence blazed brighter than anything. With nothing left to compare against, Julian became the only anchor in her mind. The ritual completed, the bronze door groaned, heavy and ancient, and slowly opened to reveal a long corridor paved with faintly glowing stone. Elara collapsed. Her hands were dotted with countless tiny punctures, yet not a single drop of blood spilled. She looked up at Julian, her ash-gray eyes now wide with confusion, lost as a child in darkness. "Who are you?" she whispered, and the tremor in her voice made Julian's long-stilled heart feel as if it were being squeezed. Julian knelt before her. In her eyes, the fierce ambition of the necromancer who wanted to restore House Vance was gone. Only a young woman remained, frightened and unmoored. She had sacrificed the memories of why she had made the covenant. She had forgotten her original purpose. "I'm Julian," he said, and his voice came out so gentle it startled even him. "I'm the one who swore to walk with you until the last moonlight fades." Elara stared at him for a long time. She didn't remember him the right way, but the soul thread still trembled. Something familiar wrapped around her like warmth she couldn't explain. She lifted her hand, as if to touch his cheek. Julian stayed still. He wanted that touch more than anything, but he knew the rule. "Don't, Elara. If we touch now, the covenant will collapse when you're at your weakest. You'll disappear." Elara lowered her hand, her breath frosting in the air. "I'm so cold, Julian. Why am I here? Why do I feel like I've lost something?" "Because you're a warrior," Julian lied painfully, "and every warrior carries scars." He stood, gesturing down the corridor. "We have to keep moving. The one behind us will wake soon." Behind them, Malachi was crawling up from the rubble. Hatred burned in his eyes. He saw the open door, saw the verse within reach. "You can't run forever, crippled spirit." Malachi bellowed, his voice raw. "The verse belongs to the Order, and that girl will be the final sacrifice." Julian didn't look back. He led Elara deeper into the heart of the whispering ruins. The farther they went, the clearer the whispers became. They were no longer meaningless sound, they were lines of poetry, fragments of ancient incantation from the eternal verse itself. Elara walked like a sleepwalker. The world around her was fading. Her vision began to fail. The glowing stones smeared into soft, bleeding streaks. She could no longer see Julian's features, only a tall, steady silhouette guiding her forward. "Julian, I can't see clearly," she breathed, her steps wobbling. Julian stopped. He knew what the loss of sight meant, the final cost, before she became wholly shadow. He had to end this quickly. "Close your eyes, Elara," Julian said, stepping closer until the space between them was measured in millimeters. "Stop using your eyes. Use mine. Feel through the covenant." He gathered his will and pushed the sight of a spirit into her mind. Elara shuddered. Suddenly, the world appeared in a new language. Not stone and dust, but streams of silver and gold energy. She saw the threads of magic webbing the air, and she saw Julian not as a dark shape, but as something radiant and commanding, an entity crowned in power, with the heart of light beating a deep, solemn rhythm. It was almost a touch of souls. A surge rose in Elara: admiration, gratitude, and a longing she didn't dare name. She realized that even if she had forgotten her parents, Forgotten House Vance, she could never forget Julian. He had become her entire world. They reached a wide stone dais in the center of a circular chamber. Upon it lay a scroll of human skin, radiating a crushing pressure. The eternal verse. There, Julian said, alertness tightening his voice. But be careful. The second layer of the covenant still holds a trap. Whoever touches the verse must pay with the only thing they have left. What do I have left to lose? Elara gave a thin, tragic smile and stepped closer. At that moment, a heavy crash sounded from behind. Malachi had shattered the bronze barrier and charged in, the cinder heart blazing like a living coal. Behind him surged a group of order mages, already preparing a cleansing rite. Stop! Malachi roared. If you touch it, you will die. Julian moved in front of Elara, his darkness flaring. You'll have to step over my body, Inquisitor. The final confrontation began. Elara stood between two forces, her hand only inches from the verse. She felt herself being torn apart. On one side, immortality, the thing she had once craved, though she no longer remembered why. On the other, Julian's presence, the only thing that made her feel she still existed. If she claimed the verse, she could become immortal, but the covenant would end and Julian would vanish. If she did not, they would both be destroyed by Malachi. And in that tearing moment, Elara understood, immortality was not the end. Immortality without the one you love is only an endless curse. She looked at Julian at the steadfast line of his back shielding her from the Order's blows. She made her choice. She did not touch the verse in the ordinary way. She took her silver-hilted dagger and cut her palm where the bronze punctures had not yet healed, and let her blood spill onto the scroll. But instead of chanting for power, she spoke a new covenant, one she forged from the deepest hunger left inside her. In the name of my blood, in the name of Julian Thorne's soul, I renounce lonely immortality. I demand an eternal binding where life and death become one. Light erupted from the verse, but it was not silver. It was a blazing purple-red. The chamber convulsed. The Order's mages were thrown back by a tidal wave of power. Malachi held his ground the longest, only to witness something he had never imagined. The eternal verse was melting, seeping into Elara's flesh and threading into Julian's soul. They were doing the forbidden thing. They were merging souls. The consequence hit like a blade to the heart. Elara felt her body splintering into 1,000 shards of light, while Julian felt death's cold being burned away by the heat of Elara's blood. And in that agony, they touched. Not a brush through air, an embrace of spirit, complete and absolute. Elara tasted every wound, every victory, every century of Julian's loneliness. Julian felt Elara's quiet sacrifices, the courage hidden beneath her ambition. The old covenant shattered, and a new covenant, darker, more passionate, was born. The silence after the magical storm was more terrifying than the screaming of torn spirits. At the heart of the whispering ruins, dust and smoke from shattered stone floated in the air, braiding itself into the fading crimson-violet light of the eternal verse. Elara Vance stood there, her breathing broken, her chest rising and falling as if she had sprinted across miles of battlefield. But strangely, she could not hear her own heart. The only rhythm echoing inside her ribs was slow, deep, and inexorable. Julian Thorne's heartbeat. She lifted a hand to cover her mouth, yet her pale hands no longer felt like hers. Looking down, she saw them veiled in a thin silver mist, threaded with thick black streaks of shadow. Blood from the cut on her palm did not drip to the floor, it rose, spiraling around her wrist like ruby chains. What did we do? Elara whispered. Her voice was no longer purely her own bright, feminine tone. A lower register vibrated beneath it, as if a man were speaking with her from a far-off emptiness. The fusion made her shudder, a sense of being overwhelmed crawling along her spine. Julian materialized close behind her. His presence was no longer a separate shadow. He was dense, so dense Elara could feel the pressure of his silver armor pressing against her silk, though they still did not touch in the physical sense. The border between them had blurred so completely that this nearness carried a burning heat. You broke nature's law, Elara. Julian's voice rang inside her mind, and at the same time trembled through her throat. You didn't summon me to serve anymore. You invited me inside. We are two people sharing one house, and that house is your body. Across the chamber, Malachi was dragging himself upright from the rubble. The High Inquisitor looked more ruined than ever, the Order's white cloak torn, his face scraped raw by jagged stone. Yet his eyes' pupils blazing red with the Cinder Heart's magic still clung to greed. He stared at Elara, or rather at the hybrid existence standing where she had been. Abomination, Malachi hissed. You've made yourselves an abomination to the light. Soul merging is the deepest taboo of every blood moon rite. Elara Vance, you have no idea what you've brought into yourself. Malachi raised the Cinder Heart. Its red glow was no longer brilliant, it had curdled into the ashen gray of dying embers. He began to chant a high-level cleansing curse, a working powerful enough to crush a summoned soul inside its host. Julian, Elara called silently. Fear rose in her by instinct, and was instantly drowned beneath Julian's iron will, flooding her mind and smothering anxiety like a boot stamping out flame. Let me, Julian answered. Suddenly, Lara felt she no longer controlled her hands. A vast, ancient strength, disciplined, tactical, born of war, claimed her muscles. Her right arm lifted, not to form a spell, but to seize the air with the soldier's precision. A blade formed, a sort of silver light and dense black shadow, its edge trembling as if hungry. She know. Julian, wearing her body, surged forward. The speed was so violent the air seemed to rip. Malachi lurched backward, flinging a stream of red fire from the relic. But the sword in Elara's hand cleaved it in half as easily as rotten cloth. When the blade stopped a hair's breadth from Malachi's throat, a lethal stillness fell. Elara saw the tremor in the Inquisitor's eyes. She saw her own reflection in his pupil. A young woman with eyes burning silver, black smoke unfurling around her like the wings of a great hawk. Kill him, a voice said. It was unfamiliar, cold as ice, and it came from the far shadowed edge of the chamber. All three froze. From behind a collapsed stone pillar, a figure stepped out. A tall, thin man draped in a cloak spun from spider silk, delicate, glittering like frost. His face looked young, yet his eyes carried the exhaustion of thousands of years. On his brow, a torn full moon sigil glowed with a bleak, bruised light. The Architect, Julian whispered through Elara's mouth. The name weighted with hatred and caution. I'm pleased you still remember me, Julian Thorne, the man said, his smile thin and dangerous. I am Valerius, the one who wrote the eternal verse with my own blood and my own hollow promises. And this girl, she has done what no one has dared to do for centuries. Malachi shook and dropped to his knees. My lord, you have returned. Valerius did not spare the Inquisitor a glance. He walked toward Elara, and with each step, the ruins' whispers fell silent. You chose fusion instead of simple immortality. An interesting choice. But do you understand the price of the Covenant's second layer? Elara fought for her voice. You made this curse. What do you want? Valerius stopped at the tip of her shadow sword without fear. He lifted a bony finger and lightly touched the blade's darkness. The sword dissolved into smoke at once. I want to see how desire ends, Valerius said. You believe merging is how you stay together? No, Lady Vance. Merging is the fastest way to erase you both. Julian's soul is too strong for a mortal body. Every minute he remains inside you, he is without intending to burning away your senses to keep himself real. Pain struck Elara like confirmation. Her ears rang, then the ringing collapsed into nothing. Valerius' voice became distant, then vanished entirely. She could still see his lips moving, still see Malachi trembling, but the world of sound slammed shut. Smell was gone, taste was gone, touch was fading, and now hearing, only sight remained, and even that sight was turning into the gray palette of ash. Elara staggered back, but instead of falling onto the cold stone, she felt an invisible, powerful lift. Julian was holding her up with spirit force alone. Don't listen to him, Elara. Julian's voice reached her directly inside her soul, bypassing her now deaf ears. He lies. He wants us afraid so he can take the verse. But I can't hear anymore, Julian. Elara thought, tears spilling, yet she could not feel their warmth on her cheek. I'm disappearing. I don't even feel like Elara anymore. Valerius watched with cruel delight. Behold the romance of darkness. One dying so the other can exist. You want to leave here? I can help. But in return, when the moon is full in 3 days, you will bring the verse to the altar of silence. Refuse, and this girl becomes a soulless stone statue. While Julian is trapped inside it forever, he flicked his hand. A dense black fog swallowed the chamber. Malachi and the Order's guards were swept away like dry leaves. When the fog thinned, Elara realized she was standing at the edge of the eastern forest, far from the whispering ruins. Dawn was near. The moon was bleaching out of the sky. Elara collapsed onto grass drenched with night dew. She could see the dew on each blade, the dark green of leaves, but she could not hear morning birds, could not smell wet earth, could not feel the cold kiss of moisture on skin. Julian pulled himself free of her body and manifested beside her. The fusion had left marks on him. His armor now bore patterns matching the moon sigil on Elara's neck, and his eyes carried her ash-gray hue. He looked at her, pain carved into every line of his face. He wanted to hold her, to comfort the girl who had traded everything for him, but he knew the law. After fusion, the taboo was more fragile than ever. If he touched her now, with his spirit force and chaos, he might devour what little remained of her soul by accident. Julian reached out, stopping just before her cheek. He gathered his will and sent a sensation, instead an inward vibration of protection and devotion. Elara looked up. Though she could not hear, she understood. She smiled, faint but stubborn. She took out Malachi's slip of paper, the only thing she still had. "We have to keep going," she forced the words out, unable to hear her own voice to shape it. Her tone came out hoarse and strange. Julian nodded. He knew they had almost no time. 3 days until the full moon. 3 days to find a way to break Valeria's demand without surrendering the verse or themselves. He guided her to a small rock cave hidden behind thick brush to rest. Elara was beyond exhaustion. She leaned her head against the cold stone wall. In the cave's darkness, Julian sat opposite her. He did not sleep. Spirits did not need sleep, but he closed his eyes to focus on keeping the soul thread from snapping. In the absolute quiet of a soundless world, Elara felt a new sensitivity awaken. With her ordinary senses gone, she began to perceive Julian's inner currents as emotional chakras, his tides of feeling with terrifying clarity. She felt regret gnawing at him, regret for accepting the summoning, regret for letting her suffer. And she felt something else, a fierce, buried longing and affection Julian had kept entombed for centuries. He loved her. Not the love of a spirit for a master, but the love of a man for a woman who had seen through his darkness. Elara reached out into the cave's gloom. She couldn't see clearly. Her sight was already weakening in the dark, but she sensed warmth radiating from Julian. She moved her hand toward that warmth. Her fingers touched something soft, cold, the edge of Julian's cloak. Instantly, a violent current surged through her, and an aftershock flipped the world. Instead of pain, she felt an explosion of sensation. For one heartbeat, she heard wind outside the cave, smelled pine, and felt cloth under her fingertips. Julian's eyes snapped open. He stared at her hand gripping his cloak. He knew this was lethal danger, but he did not pull away. The craving to be physically real was too strong. "Elara," he whispered into her mind. She leaned closer, her breath spilling against his chest. Julian felt his heart race. He lowered his head until his forehead lightly met hers. It was the most intense soul contact they had ever shared. Through that point of connection, memory, pain, and hope poured into one another. They stood on the edge of unmaking, yet in that moment, they had never felt more whole. But the happiness did not last. A small crack sounded from the sigil on Elara's neck. A thin fracture appeared in her skin, leaking the verse's crimson-violet glow. The price of closeness was the cracking of the vessel. Enough. Julian pulled back sharply, his eyes full of self-loathing. "If we continue, your body will shatter before the full moon." Elara recoiled, wrapping trembling arms around herself. The brief flare of sensation vanished again, leaving only emptiness so deep it hurt. "Julian, don't leave me," she thought, hoping he could hear her. "I will never leave you," Julian promised, though he knew the promise might be their death sentence. "But we must find Valerius. He's the only one who knows how to separate souls without killing the host. Or at least, he once did." The first day of the final moon cycle began. Pale dawn outside the cave offered no warmth to Elara, but it lit the hard road ahead. They would have to reach the altar of silence, but on the way, they would face not only the order, but Elara's ongoing erosion. Every step was now a battle. Elara could barely see. She walked on faith and Julian's guidance. He became her eyes, her ears, her hands, and her spirit. That dependence forged a strange bond. They were no longer two individuals, but a single symbiotic life, where the line between love and possession blurred. On the cave wall, the verse's ancient characters began to appear on their own, written as if by Elara's blood. Julian read the lines and went pale. What is it? Elara sensed his terror. The verse is rewriting itself, Julian whispered. It isn't speaking of immortality anymore. It's speaking of an exchange. Elara, the verse wants me to become the living one, and you will become my shadow. This was the true second layer, a ruthless trade Valerius had planted from the beginning. The summoner becomes the chained one, and the chained one becomes free. Elara fell still. She had sacrificed everything for power, only to discover she had been shaped into an offering so ancient soul could be reborn. But when she looked at Julian, she didn't see a thief. She saw someone suffering under the same truth. If that's the only way you can live, Elara began to think. No, Julian cut her off. Never. I will not build my life on the ruins of your soul. He stood and looked toward the horizon, where Oakhaven's towers still rose faintly through the mist. We go back to Oakhaven. The Order's library holds Valerius' last records before exile. There's another way. There has to be. They began the journey back to where it all started, but this time, they were no longer Necromancer and Spirit. They were fugitives from fate carrying a secret that could collapse the entire order of the living world. Elara Vance's world had become a single dense block of blackness, silent as an ancient tomb. The loss of sight and hearing was not merely the loss of two senses. It was like being thrown into a bottomless abyss where time and space no longer meant anything. She couldn't hear her own breathing, couldn't hear leaves shifting underfoot, and couldn't even see her hand when she lifted it before her face. But in that void, one lighthouse remained. Julian Thorne. She sensed him not through eyes or ears, but through a sixth sense blooming from the fracture in her soul. He was a cold heat, a steady vibration inside her mind. When Julian drew near, the darkness in Elara's head rippled. Don't fight it, Elara. Julian's voice came not from outside, but as if it were carved directly into her cortex. Open your mind. Let me be your light. Elara drew a slow breath, though she could not smell the air. She released her last defenses and let the soul thread widen. Suddenly, a blinding radiance burst through the dark, not sunlight's golden blaze, but a strange silver-blue light, a spirit sight. The world appeared to Elara in an uncanny form. Trees were no longer wood and leaves, but pale green currents of energy. The ground was layered gray matter, vibrating to the planet's pulse. And Julian stood before her, brilliant as a god of shadow. He was no longer a faint silhouette. In this shared vision, he was the most vivid existence in the world, his silver armor sparking with tiny flashes, his eyes deep ocean blue. Elara reached out and stumbled toward him. Julian lifted a hand to catch her, then stopped. The distance between his half-real fingers and her skin shrank to mere millimeters. Elara could feel his tension, a fierce need to protect, restrained by fear of consequence. We're close to Oakhaven's gates, Julian murmured through their soul link. The Order has set a sensory ward. If we enter through the main road, they'll detect my presence immediately. Elara forced herself to focus on his shape. The library. We have to reach the Iron Veil's restricted archive. Valerius' manuscript is only there. Julian guided her along paths only the dead would know. Because Elara was using his eyes, every step depended entirely on him. He had to keep his hand behind her back, never touching, but close enough that the chill of his presence could steer her. The nearness created a heavy sensual pressure, a dance between two beings who could not touch, yet were fused in perception. As they slipped through a neglected side gate, Elara noticed something terrifying in her own body. In spirit sight, her left arm was losing the color of life. It no longer glowed with energy flow. It was turning gray, stiff, stone-like. Julian, look, Elara thought. Julian stopped and stared down at her arm. Pain and self-blame sharpened his gaze. The petrification has begun. Valeria's curse is draining your life to pay for my freedom. Every second I remain manifested outside your body, it accelerates. Then go back inside, Elara begged. Fuse again. I don't care about losing myself, I just don't want to. Vanish before we find the answer. Julian shook his head, grief-heavy resolve settling over him. If I re-enter you now, my spirit force will crush your weakening mind. I have to stay outside to manage the magic around us. Endure, Elara. We only need 1 hour in the library. They moved through Oakhaven's empty alleys. The city that was once bustling looked like a ghost city in Elara's spirit sight. Its residents slid past as faint, hollow sparks. The contrast was absurd. The living looked dead, and the dead man was the only one with vivid life enough to guide her. At the gates of the Order's great evergreen library, guards stood with silver spears glinting under moonlight. Julian pulled Elara behind a stone wall. I'll weave an illusion to distract them, Julian said. But to do it, I'll need to draw a little more energy from you. Elara, are you sure you want to keep going? She looked into his eyes, feeling the only warmth still left inside her soul. Do it. Julian closed his eyes. He raised a hand, and black threads of smoke spun a new shape in the air. A small blast erupted across the square, snapping the guard's attention away. Immediately, Julian guided Elara through the gap, swift as a cold wind. Inside the library, the air was thick with old paper and sealed magic. Elara felt their shared vision begin to tremble. The fatigue of feeding Julian's spellwork was draining her to the edge. Her left arm could no longer move at all. It was heavy, cold, marble dead. They found the restricted archive deep underground, hidden behind a wall of enchanted books. Julian placed his hand on the sealing runes. Elara's blood still smeared on the edge of his cloak from the ritual in the ruins began to glow. The door groaned open. Inside were shelves holding the darkest secrets of history. Julian scanned the labels until he stopped at a dust-choked file bearing Valeria's mark. Found it, Julian breathed. He opened the book, and instantly a trap sprang. A blinding flare erupted, triggering the entire library's alarm. We've been discovered, Julian shouted inside Elara's mind. In the chaos, Julian instinctively grabbed Elara's remaining hand to pull her forward. A direct touch. At once, a catastrophic shock detonated between them. The Moonbound Covenant reacted violently to flesh contact. Elara felt her soul yanked toward Julian by a vast gravitational pull, while her body made the cracking sound of stone under strain. But inside that pain, an expensive emotional moment surfaced. Elara didn't feel fear. She felt Julian's mind, not words, but images. Julian kneeling beside an unnamed grave. Julian swearing he would protect her even if it meant dissolving into nothing. He loved her not because she was his summoner, but because she was the only one who looked into his darkness and didn't turn away. Julian, stop. You're fading. Elara cried through the bond, seeing his form begin to blur, pieces of him, fragments of memory, being drawn back toward her. Julian did not release her hand. Determination burned in his eyes. I won't let them take you. With his last reserve of spirit force, he shoved Elara into a hidden recess in the wall just as Malachi and the Order's mages stormed in. Stay there, Julian commanded, his voice weakened but absolute. Do not come out until the moon slips behind the tower's peak. Elara was sealed inside the recess. This time, she was truly alone, because Julian severed the shared sight to shield her from Malachi's tracking spells. She sat in absolute silence. Her left hand was stone. Her right still carried the ghost-cold imprint of Julian's touch. Trust tipped into a thick black despair. She understood the consequence of that touch. Julian had poured a large part of his being into her to hide himself. But that meant her body now carried an unbearable pressure. A thin crack appeared on her cheek, leaking the verse's crimson-violet glow. She was becoming a broken vessel holding a dying god. Outside the recess, she could sense violent magical impacts. Julian was fighting alone in a weakened state. Each explosion, each wave of force slamming through stone, made their shared heart clench with pain. What if he doesn't come back? Elara wondered, tears falling and sinking into the crack, making it sting like fire, and she understood the second layer again. It wasn't only a life-death exchange, it was parasitism. For one to live, the other didn't merely die, they endured the agony of the one left behind. In the darkness, Elara brushed against something Julian had pressed into her hand. A torn page from Valeria's file. She couldn't see it with ordinary eyes, but the magic in her blood read the raised script like touch vision. To reverse the exchange, the chained one must sacrifice what they desire most as the living. Freedom can only be reached through the eternal submission of the heart. Elara went still. What Julian desired most as a living man was to touch her, to love her as a normal human being. To save her, he would have to surrender that desire. He would have to accept becoming forever cold spirit, never able to touch her again. The sounds outside ceased abruptly. The recess door creaked open. A figure stumbled in. Julian, yet he looked like a ghost of himself. His form was translucent, silver fractures webbing his armor. He saw the crack on Elara's face, and he dropped to his knees. "I've taken too much from you," he whispered, his voice thinning into the air. Elara wanted to tell him she would give him everything, but she realized she had lost the ability to speak. She could only lift her stone hand with crushing effort, reaching for him again, even knowing it might be the end for them both. Julian recoiled, agony flooding his eyes. "Don't, Elara. If we touch now, we'll never be able to return. The full moon is close. We have to leave the city immediately." He helped her stand using a strip of cloth he tore from the library's wreckage, anything to avoid skin contact. They escaped the library as the aftermath still smoldered. Oakhaven had become a vast trap, and every step they took was watched by the Order's eyes. Night in Oakhaven's outskirts was not the dense, pitch-black void of the Order's library. It was a blend storm blue sky and silver-gray fog ribbons hanging low over the ground. Elara Vance felt like a cracked porcelain doll, moved by invisible strings. Her steps were strangely heavy. Her left arm had petrified, completely icy, rigid, motionless, and now, her left foot was beginning to lose sensation too. Each time she moved, the sound was not cloth whispering, but stone grinding against earth, dry, harsh, haunting. Julian Thorne walked at her side, yet he no longer carried the commanding presence of a conquering general. His form was so thin that moonlight could pass through his chest, spilling onto the leaves behind him. Their soul connection was stretched tight as a lute string about to snap. Through the strip of cloth Julian used to support her, Elara felt no warmth, but she felt his trembling. Not a human shiver, but a quake deep inside the marrow of a spirit being torn apart by two opposing forces. The horror of what she had just glimpsed, Valeria's face sliding across Julian's features, still stalked Elara like an open wound. She didn't dare meet Julian's eyes. She feared that if she looked too long, the architect's cruel smile would surface again, reminding her that the man she leaned on might be nothing more than a cocoon for something worse. "Elara, you're shaking." Julian's voice sounded inside her mind, but this time, carried a strange interference like an echo from a deep underground chamber. She could not answer aloud. Speech had abandoned her throat, leaving absolute silence. She sent only a weak thought back, "I'm cold." This cold isn't from the wind. Julian stopped beside a small stream, where black water slid over smooth river stones. He carefully lowered Elara to sit against the roots of an old tree. Her movement was limited now. Every shift in posture made the cracks in her skin flare with crimson-violet pain. She looked down at her hands. The fracture on her cheek had spread down her neck, branching into strange veins like a map that led straight into death. Julian knelt before her. He stared at the cracks, regret so deep it seemed to warp the air around them. He raised his half-real hand, meaning to touch her cheek and wipe away the cold tear caught in the stone-like groove, then he jerked his hand back. He remembered the library. He remembered how close he had come to swallowing her whole, but the desire to soothe her pain was stronger than every warning. Julian gathered what spirit force he had left. He did not touch her, not truly, but he cupped his hands around Elara's face, with only a hair's breadth between spirit and stone. A strange phenomenon began at once. The air between his soul hands and Elara's petrifying skin started to heat. Not biological warmth, friction heat born from two realities, living and dead, trying to find each other. Elara closed her eyes. She felt that heat. It burned, and yet it comforted. For a moment, she forgot Valerius, forgot the order, and felt only Julian's presence, like a blanket laid over a soul freezing from the inside out. It was almost touch, a sensual intersection of warmth and longing, tragic and intimate at once. Elara's breath that tasted like cold stone mingled with Julian's spirit aura that smelled of snow. She ached to lean forward, to close that last sliver of space with the real touch, even knowing it would be destruction. "Don't leave me," her thought trembled through the bond. "I'm here, Elara." "Always," Julian answered. And the instant he formed that promise, something inside the soul thread shifted. Elara suddenly felt a current of thought that was not Julian's. Dark, cold, patiently amused. Not regret, anticipation. "Do you see it now, little lady?" A third voice slid into her mind like a snake. "The more he tries to save you, the faster he becomes me. His sacrifice is food for my return." Elara's eyes flew open, staring at Julian. His eyes were still deep blue, but in their depth, she saw another shadow smiling. Valerius wasn't merely hidden, he was parasitic, feeding on Julian's love and self-sacrifice. Every protective act Julian made unknowingly strengthened the exchange curse. The shock flipped Elara's emotions from safety to paralyzing fear. She wanted to shove Julian away, to scream a warning, but her body was a stone prison. A new ritual rule crystallized in her mind. The mirror soul, when the vessel cracks, the darkest secrets inside begin to leak outward. And what Julian had been hiding was this. He had sensed Valerius too, and he had been pretending not to, buying time, borrowing power, staying strong enough to protect her. Julian saw panic in her gaze. He pulled back, his hands fading thinner. "What did you see?" he asked, his inner voice more ragged than ever. Elara forced her right hand, still faintly responsive, to scratch into the damp soil beside the stream. The letters came shaky, crooked, desperate. Via Lerius. Julian stared at the name. Heavy silence collapsed over them. Nearby leaves shriveled, as if poisoned by something unseen. He wasn't surprised. A bitter, sorrowful smile twisted his mouth. "I know," Julian whispered. "I feel him in every breath of my soul. He is the price of the immortality I once sought, and now, he is the price of staying beside you." He stood and looked toward the distance, where the altar of silence rose like a broken tooth behind gray mountains. "He wants me to exchange with you. He wants me to take your life, so he can claim a perfect physical body. But he doesn't understand one thing." Julian turned back. A wild determination burned in his eyes. "I can destroy myself before he finishes." Pain ripped through Elara, not the pain of petrification, but the agony of betrayal and self-erasure. She did not want Julian gone. She would rather turn fully to stone than exist in a world where he did not, or worse, where he existed wearing another's face. They continued into the Greywood, where even Moonlight looked drained and lifeless. Elara now depended completely on Julian. Her left foot had stiffened. She had to drag it. Julian shaped an invisible support beneath her, letting her glide like a ghost over the ground. Every step was an exchange. Elara felt the borrowed vision Julian's spirit sight begin to fracture with black flecks. The silver energy world was being invaded by darkness. She saw the forest's magical currents being pulled inward by the verse, forming an invisible vortex around them. "We're close," Julian said. "The altar of silence. That's where the final oath will be forced." As they neared the mountain's base, a group from the Order emerged out of the fog. Not Malachi this time, black judges, executioners of the Iron Veil. They held no silver spears. They carried enchanted mirrors capable of reflecting the truth of a soul. "Halt, sinners," one judge shouted. "You carry the seed of annihilation. Hand over the verse and submit to cleansing." Julian said nothing. He shoved Elara behind a large stone slab. Darkness exploded around him, violent, feral, more brutal than she had ever felt. This wasn't the discipline of a general. It was the strength of a soul being gnawed by a demon. He launched himself into battle. From behind the stone, Elara could only see collisions of black and silver light. Through the bond, she felt each strike Julian landed. But something was wrong. Julian did not hold back. He fought with a cruelty she had never seen. Each time a judge fell, Julian's aura shifted toward crimson violet. "Stop, Julian. You're letting him take you," Elara screamed inside the link. But Julian seemed not to hear. He was sinking into a blood-drunk trance of ancient magic. Only when the last judge collapsed did he freeze amid the wreckage. He turned. For a heartbeat, his eyes were entirely black, no trace of ocean blue. He walked toward Elara, footsteps heavy as judgment itself. Elara backed away in terror, until stone met her spine, the cliff wall behind her. Julian leaned down, his face inches from hers. His breath smelled of blood and ash. He reached out and gripped her throat, not to choke, but with a possessive, threatening claim. "Do you feel this power, Elara?" The voice that came from Julian's mouth was not his. It was Valerius. "This is what you always wanted, immortality through destruction. Let me in, and I will show you the world beneath your feet." Elara did not close her eyes. She stared into the blackness. She searched for Julian. She knew he was still there, locked inside his own soul. She lifted her stone hand and, with unbearable effort, pressed it to his chest where their shared heart beat in a frantic, broken rhythm. With the last of her will, she sent him a memory, their first meeting in the attic room, when Julian had looked at her with contempt and also with unwilling curiosity. She reminded him of who he had been, a general who valued honor above survival. The memory struck like a bell. Julian's body convulsed. The black in his eyes retreated, giving way to storm sea blue. Julian let out a raw cry, released her throat, and collapsed to his knees, gasping as if he'd surfaced from deep water. "I'm sorry, Elara. I can't control it," he whispered, his form now badly fractured. The battle and the possession left Elara's body critically damaged. The crack at her neck had spread across her chest. She felt her lungs stiffening, breathing becoming brutally difficult. Each breath carried the rasp of stone grinding against stone. Julian rose. He no longer had enough spirit force to maintain her invisible support. He had to carry her, hooking an arm around her waist. For the first time in many chapters, they sustained physical contact, even through cloth. Elara felt his presence more vividly than ever. The sensual tension between approaching death and the desperate need to belong filled the air, gloomy, intimate, fever bright. They climbed the last steps to the altar of silence. At the summit was a wide stone plain. At its center stood a circular altar table surrounded by 12 broken pillars. Above them, moonlight had turned the vivid red of a blood moon. "We're here," Julian said, his voice so weak it nearly dissolved into the wind. Above the stone table, the verse scroll floated, radiating a terrifying halo. But beside, it was something else, something neither of them expected. A massive bronze mirror. It did not reflect the altar. It reflected another world. Elara, in a pure white dress, skin warm and alive, standing beside a flesh and bone Julian in a general's brilliant uniform. They were smiling in a sunflower garden flooded with sunlight. "That is the vision of a successful exchange," a voice said. Malachi stepped out from behind a pillar. He no longer looked dignified. He looked fever-mad, eyes blazing. "But to obtain it, one of you must willingly step into the mirror and be imprisoned forever in the gray world." Elara stared at the mirror, then at Julian. This was the second layer made visible. The verse did not grant immortality. It granted a choice between two agonies: remain together in destruction, or watch the other become happy in your absence. Malachi laughed, advancing with the silver dagger. "Who will sacrifice? The ambitious summoner or the noble spirit? Hurry, before the blood moon sets. If you don't choose, you'll both turn to ash." Julian looked at Elara. In his eyes, she saw the answer. He was preparing to push her into the mirror, so she could live, so she could return to being Elara Vance, even if it meant he would remain trapped with Valerius forever. But Elara had her own decision. She remembered the torn page from Valerius' file. Under blood moonlight, hidden ink surfaced on the back. "The truth is not in the exchange, but in the mirror's collapse. The one who dares shatter the illusion will find the third path." Elara looked from the bronze mirror to Julian's eyes. She felt Valerius smiling somewhere deep inside the crack, waiting for one of them to choose wrong. She gathered the last strength in her stone hand, not to push Julian, but to clasp his hand tightly, with everything she had left. The sound of breaking was nothing like ordinary porcelain or common glass. When Elara's petrified body struck the ancient bronze mirror, a deep, muted boom rolled across the summit as if the world's axis itself had been snapped. The mirror's fragments did not fall. They shot upward, hanging in the blood moonlight like tiny silver blades, each one reflecting 1,000 different visions of past and future. Elara collapsed onto the stone of the altar of silence. Her left arm, already rigid, was now laced with deep fractures from the impact. She felt no physical pain, her nerves had died long ago, but she felt her soul splitting cleanly in two. Julian Thorne surged forward. He no longer kept his distance. His mist-thin hands closed over her stone shoulders, holding her together so she wouldn't crumble into ash beneath the storm of shards. Elara, what have you done? Julian shouted, his voice equal parts horror and a wounded kind of awe. She could not answer out loud, but through the soul thread, vibrating like a snapped wire, she sent a hard, unmistakable feeling. I do not choose the exchange. I choose us. Reality around them began to warp. The crimson-violet sky of the blood moon tore open, revealing a black gulf behind the shattered mirror. It was not the darkness of night, it was the void, where Valerius had been imprisoned for thousands of years. From that abyss came the architect's laughter, no longer a whisper inside the mind, but a tangible sound that made the altar's pillars tremble and crack. A beautiful defiance. Valerius stepped out from the wreckage of illusion. He no longer wore a refined, elegant form. His body was now stitched together by crimson-violet strands of the verse, like veins exposed outside the skin. You shattered the mirror to seek a third path? But do you know, that path is reserved only for those who dare to vanish together? Malachi stood nearby, his face twisted with fear. The silver dagger slipped from his fingers and clattered on stone. My lord, you promised. If I brought them here, you are only a rusted tool. Malachi, Valerius flicked his hand as if brushing away dust. At once, thread-like strands of verse wrapped the High Inquisitor, lifting him into the air. No blood spilled yet, Elara saw his spirit force drain out in a single heartbeat. Malachi turned into a dry stone statue, then collapsed into fine powder that the mountain wind carried away. The consequences of breaking the mirror began to strike Elara and Julian. By the law of the Covenant, they had shattered. When illusion is refused, two souls are forced to face the absolute truth. Elara felt her body was no longer stone, yet it did not return to human flesh. She was becoming a creature of the verse, a being made of luminous letters and pain. The crack at her throat spread to her left breast, where her heart thudded its last, weakening beats. Julian changed as well. His form was no longer translucent. It began to fracture in the same pattern as Elara's. They looked like two pieces of a broken image, trying to fit back together inside a storm. Julian met Elara's gaze. In this moment, the yearning to touch was no longer forbidden, it was survival. He raised his hand. His fingers, once pale mist, now carried a crimson-violet glow that matched the wounds in her. He lightly touched the crack on Elara's stone cheek. A sensual shock detonated between them, not the sensation of skin, but the collision of two dying currents of energy. Elara felt Julian's winter snow essence sink into her core. Julian felt the last warmth of her blood flood into him. They did not dissolve. Their contact forged a barrier of light around them, pushing back Valerius' thread veins. We are one, Julian murmured, resting his forehead to hers. Stone or smoke, I will not let him take a single piece of you again. Valerius narrowed his eyes. The pleasure drained from his face, replaced by cold anger. You believe love can rewrite the verse? The verse was written in betrayal. To endure, one must always serve as the other's stepping stone. He lifted his hand, and the summit of the altar of silence began to collapse. Massive stones tore free and floated, drawn into a vast spiraling vortex. Valerius was trying to force their souls into an involuntary exchange cycle. This was the decisive moment of Arc 1. Elara realized that defeating Valerius wasn't merely about protecting Julian. She had to act, to swallow the verse parasitizing him, while allowing him to draw out the stone sealing her. Not a trade of domination, a trade of balance. Julian, take my eyes, Elara sent, fierce and final, and give me your heart. Julian stilled for a breath, then he understood. He leaned down, his kiss stopping on the threshold of her cold stone lips. An almost touch, an absolute surrender. As their mouths nearly met, white light flooded the entire mountaintop. A new ritual law snapped into place. The paradox of shared sacrifice. When two beings willingly surrender their living part to the other, the covenant self-destructs and reconstructs. Emotion shifted, violently, from despair into a lucid, terrifying clarity. Elara felt herself lift weightless. She saw Valeria's soul as it truly was, a solitary creature, terrified of death, who had turned himself into a hollow text to outrun the end. She no longer feared him. Another explosion tore through the air. Valerius roared as his verse threads were dragged inward, pulled into the core of the connection between Elara and Julian. The void began to close, dragging the architect back into the eternal darkness he had built. When the brilliance faded, the mountain returned to stillness. The blood moon had set, replaced by the first pale lines of dawn on the horizon. Elara lay on cold stone. Her body had become soft again, yet she still could not feel the sun's warmth. Her left arm was no longer stone, but it was covered in silver verse patterns, a mark that would never fade. She opened her eyes, and her sight was now permanently layered, the physical world superimposed over the spirit world. Beside her, Julian sat. He had not vanished. He had not become fully alive. He existed more clearly than ever, half material, able to be touched, yet his breath still carried the scent of snow, and his heart beat in the same rhythm as hers. The Covenant had changed. They were no longer summoner and enslaved spirit. They were two exiles between worlds, bound by a truth no one else could understand. "We survived," Julian said. His voice was warmer or real, though it still held an echo of deep wilderness. He reached out with the hand that could now feel, and took Elara's hand. A real touch. No dissolution, no petrification, only the tremor of two souls finding each other in the rubble of fate. But their relief was short-lived. Elara looked down at their joined hands and felt a new horror take shape. Each time they touched, the verse letters on her skin lit up, and a piece of her memory of the human world blurred, just slightly. This was the new price growing with closeness. To be together, they would have to accept forgetting the very world they had tried to save. The first dawn cut across the sky above Oakhaven, but it carried no golden warmth, no promise of a new day. To Elara Vance, the sun was only a pallid sphere, spilling a milky, lifeless light like the eyes of the dead. She stood atop the altar of silence, among the shattered bronze mirror and Malachi's ash, and felt an emptiness that reached all the way to the bottom of her being. Mountain wind screamed through the cracks in the stone, whipping her ash-gray hair into the air, but Elara did not feel cold. She did not feel anything. She looked down at her hands. The silver filigree of the verse no longer flared with last night's fury. It had sunk beneath her skin, forming delicate metallic veins too intricate to be human. Yet at the center of her chest, where the mark of exchange had once ruled, a tiny black spot no larger than a bean pulsed in time with her heart. It did not hurt. It simply existed with the mocking presence, like an eye watching her from within. Julian Thorne stood only a few steps away. In the morning light, his form had stabilized in a way that felt unnatural. He was no longer hazy, no longer on the verge of dissolving. His armor carried the breath of frost, and the lines of his face looked as if they had been carved from eternal ice. He stared toward the horizon, where the city of Oakhaven hovered faintly behind a wall of thick mist. "We have to leave before the remaining purifiers of the Order arrive," Julian said. His voice was deep and resonant, no longer carrying the void's echo, yet threaded with a sorrow that had no end. Elara wanted to nod, but her body responded slowly, as though it belonged to someone else. She took one step toward him, and that was when she noticed the first true horror of this new arc. At her feet, a small wildflower, purple and fragile, had pushed its way through a crack in the rock. When the toe of her boot brushed one of its leaves, the flower did not crumple. Instead, it withered instantly, turning black-gray and dissolving into ash within seconds. Life was being stolen by an accidental touch. Elara froze, eyes wide with terror. She looked down at her hand, then at the ground around her. She was becoming a magnet for vitality, a pull that stripped the living world down to dust. "Don't look at it," Julian stepped closer, his voice gentle but edged with warning. He lifted his hand as if to take hers, to steady her, then stopped in midair. His fingers trembled. The covenant has restructured itself, Elara. We are no longer master and bound spirit. We are two poles of a wrong existence. I carry death in order to remain, and you carry the verse in order to survive. Our touch now, it might be the only thing preventing you from petrifying completely, but it will also erase your memories the fastest. Elara could not speak. She could only stare at him through wet, shaking eyes. A moment of almost touch, fingertips separated by a single breath of air, yet containing an abyss of cost. Julian could sense the last warmth still lingering in her skin, the warmth he had craved for centuries. And Elara, in turn, craved his coldness, desperate for it to suit the verse's ember burning inside her chest. Go, she sent weakly along the soul thread. Before I wither this whole mountain. They began descending the peak, heading toward the Gloomhaven past the narrow road that led to the Citadel of Echoes, rumored to hold secrets for taming the verse without sacrificing the self. Their journey unfolded in heavy silence. Elara walked with careful restraint, trying not to touch anything living, but no matter how cautiously she stepped, the grass and small plants along the path wilted after she passed. She felt like a beautiful plague, an angel of decay. Julian led the way, his tall silhouette shielding her from the savage gusts of the highlands. He no longer used a strip of cloth to support her. Instead, he walked close enough that his shadow fell over her. In their shared spirit vision, Elara saw that Julian's shadow was not merely darkness, it was a still zone in reality, where the chaotic currents around her were softened into quiet. Do you remember your father's name? Julian asked suddenly when they stopped to rest beside a gray cliff face. Elara went rigid. She searched through her mind. An image surfaced. A middle-aged man with silver hair, smiling kindly beneath candlelight in their family library. She saw his lips moving, calling her name, but the sound was faint like waves crashing on a faraway shore. She knew who he was, but his name, the tether that anchored him to the world, had vanished from her memory. She shook her head, her ash-gray eyes filling with a pain too large to hold. Julian exhaled, then sat opposite her at a careful distance. That is the price of the second layer I warned you about. Our union at the altar saved both our lives, but it tore a hole in your soul. Every time we resonate, every time we fight or move with shared power, that hole devours a human memory to seal what the verse has hollowed out. He pressed a hand to his own chest, where a matching black spot pulsed in sync with hers. I have a secret, Elara. A secret Valerius used to lure me into the first covenant. Elara looked at him, curiosity braided tightly with fear. I was not the noble general history remembers, Julian said, his voice roughening. I swore to the moon not to save my army, but to avenge the woman I loved executed by the order for witchcraft. I used the blood of 100,000 soldiers to complete the first rite. I was not the Covenant's victim. I was the one who wrote its first lines with hatred. The impact struck Elara like a blow. The man she trusted, the only pillar she had left, carried an atrocity in his past. The collapse of the hero she had built inside her mind made the fracture in her chest flare. The verse's reddish-violet light surged, and the stone around them began to crack. Julian did not move. He accepted the judgment in her gaze. You have every right to despise me, but that is why Valerius still lives inside me. He feeds on my remorse. And now, he is using what I feel for you to finish the final verse. Elara wanted to shove him away, to run from this presence soaked in guilt, but the moment she rose, she realized she had nowhere to go. Beyond them waited only death and the Order's pursuit. Only beside Julian, this condemned man, did she feel like she still existed at all. She stepped closer, her trembling hands lifted, stopping inches from his face. She searched the deep blue of his eyes for the man who had guarded her through the last days. And there, inside the darkness of old sins, she found something achingly real. A gentleness that did not pretend, a pain that matched her own. We are both cracked, she sent, bitterly forgiving. If you are darkness, then I am the abyss that can hold you. Julian closed his eyes. A single tear of frost traced down his cheek, and vanished the instant it touched the air. We have to keep moving, Elara. The Citadel of Echoes isn't far. There we'll find a way to sever Valerius from this heartbeat, or at least find an ending worthy of us both. They continued into the depths of the Gloomhaven Pass. The air changed. The mist was no longer white, but ash-gray, carrying the scent of forgotten memories. Elara felt her hearing beginning to return, but not in any normal way. She couldn't hear the wind. She could hear whispers, voices of the dead imprisoned in the cliff walls. "Don't listen to them," Julian warned. He raised his hand to cover her ear, this time letting his palm brush lightly against her hair. A touch through hair alone, barely anything, yet Elara felt electricity surge through her body. Her senses detonated. She saw the sigils on Julian's armor blaze, reflecting the fractures on her skin. A sensual tension rose like a tide, so strong it made her sway, the hunger to merge, to erase the border between two beings slowly dying. And then the price struck. In her mind, the image of House Vance's library blurred. Her father's face broke apart into dark shards. She forgot the color of his eyes. She forgot the scent of old books. A piece of her soul had been swallowed by the verse to pay for that stolen closeness. Elara staggered back, clutching her head in panic. The bargain was too cruel. To feel love, she had to lose herself. And then through the ash mist ahead, figures emerged. They wore no white cloaks of the Order. Their armor was obsidian black, polished like a blade. The Obsidian Guard, the secret force tasked with hunting what belonged to neither realm. Julian Thorne and Elara Vance. A cold voice called from their leader. "You've carried the blight of the verse too far. The world of the living has no place for those rotting from the inside." Julian stepped in front of Elara, and a sword of shadow and silver formed in his hand. "Back, Elara. These aren't purifiers. They wield erasure. If you're struck, your soul will be scattered beyond saving." Battle exploded inside the gray fog. Elara stood behind him, forcing what little power she had left into the thread between them. She noticed that every time she focused her will on Julian, his blade burned brighter, yet the black spot in her chest widened by another hairline measure. She was feeding her existence into him, turning herself into a weapon. Julian fought with terrifying ferocity. He wasn't only protecting Elara, he was protecting the last fragment of hope in himself. But the Obsidian Guard were too many, and they seemed to understand the Covenant's weakness. One of them hurled a chain of dark magic, lashing it around Elara's stone arm and dragging her toward the deeper shadows. "Julian!" she screamed into the link. Julian whirled, fury igniting in his eyes. He ignored the attackers on him and lunged for Elara. He seized the chain with his bare hand, letting the erasure magic burn through his spirit flesh. A violent detonation followed as the two forces collided. The attackers were blasted back by a shockwave so strong it stripped the ground clean. When the mist thinned, the land around them had become dead, no grass, no stone left unbroken. Julian dropped to one knee. His right hand was gone entirely, leaving only strands of gray smoke drifting upward. He looked at Elara, and his smile held the shape of painful release. "I told you, I wouldn't let anyone touch you," he whispered. Elara rushed to him. She no longer cared about losing memories or turning to stone. She knelt and covered the space where his arm had been with her hands, pouring every last drop of herself into him, trying to rebuild what the erasure had taken. The silver patterns on her skin flared with blinding light, and at the same time, a door inside her mind slammed shut. She forgot the name Oakhaven. She forgot why she had become a summoner. She forgot everything except one thing. His name, Julian. Julian watched her eyes turn hollow, and he understood. She had sacrificed her identity to save him. They sat there in the dead earth of the Gloomhaven Pass, beneath a sky without moonlight. Julian Thorne, the general stained by atrocity, and Elara Vance, the girl who had forgotten herself to become a mirror for his pain. Their covenant had entered a new phase, deeper, harsh, more intimate in its cruelty. They were no longer running from Valerius. They finally understood. Valerius was not an enemy outside them. He was part of them, the price of wanting to cross the boundary between life and death. The bell of the Citadel of Echoes did not ring into Elara's ears. It struck straight into her bones. Each toll came like a seismic wave, making the cracks in her skin tremble as if they were about to split open. She could no longer hear the wind screaming through the mountain pass. no longer hear Julian's heavy steps beside her, but she could hear the sound of her own soul fracturing. Ahead, the citadel rose like a colossal scar carved into the gray cliff of the borderlands. It was not built of ordinary stone and mortar. It looked as if it had been woven from condensed fog and petrified whispers. Needle-thin towers pierced the ash-colored sky, a place where light could never fully break through. Elara stopped before the black iron gate, and she realized something terrifying. The shared sight Julian had lent her was losing its color. The white of the mist, the silver of the old moonlight, everything was draining into a dull, ash gray. She was losing the ability to recognize light. The world was becoming nothing but shadow, different shades of the same darkness. "Don't stop, Elara." Julian's voice sounded inside her mind, low, urgent, threaded with fear. "If you stop here, the echoes will surround you and swallow you whole." He moved closer. This time, there was no strip of cloth between them. He stood directly behind her, shielding her from the cold that poured from the gate like breath from a tomb. Julian lifted his hands and braced them around her shoulders, protective and also possessive. Elara felt the pressure of his armor, the chill radiating from him like an aura wrapped around her, a near touch sensual in its restraint. Elara leaned her head back against his spirit-forged chest. She could not hear her own heartbeat, but she could hear the verse pulsing in his strong, feral, seductive. For one suspended second, she wanted to turn, to sink into his cold arms, to erase the last boundary between the living and the dead. "Julian, I can't see white anymore," she sent through the link, her thought trembling. Julian tightened his hold around her without truly touching skin. "I know. It's the fading sight, the Citadel's law. Here, what belongs to reality fades, and what belongs to memory takes its place. Use my memories to see the path." They stepped through the iron gate. The world changed instantly. Inside, there were no normal corridors of stone. There was a labyrinth of sound. Elara saw ancient verse script floating in the air, not still but vibrating with voices from the past, like living ink made of regret. "The rules here are simple and brutal," Julian said, guiding her into a vast hall lined with dull, fogged mirrors. "The law of reciprocity. Everything you see or hear is part of your companion's memory. Here, I will see your memories, and you will see mine. We will have no secrets left." The consequence struck at once. Elara faced one of the mirror walls, but she did not see herself turning to stone. She saw a boy with deep blue eyes standing in a burning field. He held a wooden sword, his gaze fierce with determination, yet drenched in grief. Julian when he was a child. Then the image shifted. She saw Julian in a general's uniform, standing before a gallows. A woman with hair like flame stared at him. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a vast, endless sorrow. "Don't look," Julian roared in her mind, his form suddenly thickening into violent darkness. Too late. Elara had already felt his pain. She saw the moment he signed the first covenant with Valerius, not in ink, but in the blood of that very woman. The truth knifed through what remained of her heart. The man she loved, the one she had clung to as salvation, had begun this loop of darkness with a betrayal so cruel it tasted like ash. The emotional shift from absolute trust to cold, stunned disbelief made the fracture in Elara's chest widen. Reddish-violet light erupted, illuminating the shadowed hall. She stumbled back, her stone hand striking a statue, shattering it into pieces. Julian manifested in front of her. His face wore a cruelty she had never seen. Valerius was using Julian's pain to climb higher. "Now you've seen it," he said, his voice like a curse. "I'm not the hero in your story, Elara. I'm the damned thing you woke by accident." Elara could not speak. She could only cry. Colorless tears rolled down her stone cheek, leaving shimmering trails in the dark. And in that moment she understood another ritual law of the Citadel, the echo's price. To reach the center, one of them would have to erase a memory of the other, making room for a new verse to be written. Julian stepped closer, his eyes now completely black. He raised his reddish-violet hand and hovered it before her forehead. "To save you from total petrification, I have to erase my memory of her. But if I erase her, I lose the last thread of my humanity. I become Valerius completely. Don't." Elara begged through the link. "If you lose your humanity, what will I be in your eyes? Just a vessel?" Julian froze, A violent struggle tore through him. He craved freedom from centuries of torment. Yet he also craved the way Elara looked at him, even now, even frightened. And he realized something sickeningly true. His suffering was the only thing still keeping him Julian Thorne. The consequence of that realization was a sudden, immense shift. Elara saw it. Julian's guilt did not make him less, his remorse made him more unbearably human, more beautiful, more dangerous, more real. She stepped forward and, this time, she took his trembling hand. A real touch. A massive surge of energy exploded between them, but it was not destruction. It was resonance. The entire citadel shuddered. The echoes of the past fell silent all at once, replaced by a single shared rhythm, one heartbeat. We won't erase anything. Elara forced out her voice, a harsh, broken scrape like stone against stone. We will carry all of it. Julian stared at her. The blackness in his eyes began to thin. The sea blue returning faint, fragile, but real. He understood then that by accepting each other's sins, they had found a third layer of the covenant. It didn't only bind souls, it bound guilt. They could not be redeemed. They could only sink together. They went deeper into the citadel. Elara felt her body changing again. Her sense of touch returned in a twisted way. She did not feel the cold of air, but she felt the rough texture of words in the corridors. She could feel the weight of a promise as it echoed past. At the citadel's heart, they found a spiral-shaped dais descending into an endless chasm. At the top of the dais rested a small bone box, exhaling the scent of withered roses, the only fragrance left in this ash world. That is the heart of echoes, Julian whispered. Inside is the final shard of the original verse. If we take it, we can rewrite the covenant. But whoever touches the box will have to endure every scream of every soul that has failed here. Elara stepped toward it. The patterns on her hand began crawling up her arm, flaring as if they wanted to escape her skin. She knew she was the only one who could touch it. She was the only living being bearing the verse's mark. And then, from the chasm below, pale shapes began to rise. Not the obsidian guard, but copies of them. Elara and Julian from earlier cycles. Versions who had failed, turned into echoes. You cannot pass us. The echoes spoke in unison, their voices like 1,000 shards of mirror cutting into the mind. Every time you draw closer, part of this world disappears. You are destroyers, not lovers. Julian swung his sword. Shadow and silver tore through the pale forms, but they re-knit themselves instantly. He was trapped in a ring of his own past. Elara placed her hand on the bone box. Immediately, millions of screams slammed into her skull. She felt herself unraveling into letters. She saw Julian collapsing into a shapeless black storm. The pain was beyond limit, so vast it made her want to let go. Then she felt warmth behind her. Julian had broken through the ring. He pressed his back against hers, pouring his will, his existence into her as an anchor. Read it, Elara. Don't listen to them. Rewrite our names. Elara opened the box. Inside was not a scroll. It was a heart of black crystal, beating slowly. She seized it, and with the last remaining awareness of his name, she carved Julian into the crystal's surface using the cracks in her own fingers. White light swallowed everything. The citadel convulsed as if it were about to collapse. The echoes were dragged screaming into the crystal heart. When the light faded, Elara realized she was lying in Julian's arms. The citadel still stood, but its gloom had changed into something unnaturally quiet. She looked down at her hand. The black crystal heart had melted into her palm, leaving a dark gem embedded beneath her skin. But the price of taking the heart of echoes was monstrous. Elara looked at Julian. She saw him more clearly than ever, and she realized she could no longer sense Valerius at all. Not because Valerius was gone, but because Valerius had fused completely with Julian. The man before her was Julian and the architect. Julian met her gaze with something utterly unfamiliar. No gentleness, no remorse. He looked at her the way a god looks at a fascinating offering. "Thank you, Elara," he said, and the shape of Valerius rang unmistakably through his voice. "You brought my heart back to me. Now, we can begin the real rite." Elara staggered back in horror. She understood. She had just freed the worst demon using love as the key. She had saved Julian from pain, and in doing so, she had removed the final barrier between him and darkness. The consequence dropped her emotions into the abyss. The third betrayal revealed itself. The verse didn't bind them so they could love. It bound them so they could become something new. A creature that would devour both life and death. The air inside the great hall of the Citadel of Echoes no longer carried the chaotic vibration of failed souls. It had become deathly still silence, established by the absolute authority of something newly reborn. Elara stood frozen, her feet seeming to root into the cold stone. Light from the black gem embedded deep in her palm, threw faint violet lightning across the stone vein lines of her arm, forming a radiant lattice that was beautiful only because it was painful. Julian No, the entity wearing his face while carrying Valerius's spirit, stood before her. He no longer looked like a spirit on the verge of collapse. Under the silver armor, every movement of muscle was filled with the dense, dark energy that made him appear taller, heavier, more overwhelming than ever. His eyes, once ocean blue with torment, now burned with the deep purple of the verse, cold and distant as dead stars. He stepped forward. The iron boot struck the floor with a dry, final sound, each beat like a sentence being read aloud. Elara tried to retreat, but her body no longer obeyed its owner. The verse patterns on her skin resonated with his presence, locking her in place in an instinctive posture of submission. "Don't look so afraid, Elara," Valerius said. The voice was Julian's, yet its tone held the echo of 1,000 years, smooth as silk, sharp as a razor. "You brought my heart back to me. You should be proud of your position now." He lifted his hand, gliding it through the air beside her cheek. Elara felt a brutal current surge through her stone skin. He didn't touch her, yet the closeness made the shared rhythm in her chest stutter into chaos. It was a sensual paradox. She loathed the thing that had taken her lover, yet her body trembled with an inexplicable hunger, a biological dependence the verse had seeded into her soul. "You're not Julie," Elara whispered, her voice breaking like grinding rock. "Julian would never look at me like that." Valerius's mouth curved into a brilliant, merciless smile. He closed the distance in a single motion, and his hand truly touched her fingers under her chin, lifting her face so she had no choice but to stare into that purple depth. This touch did not cause dissolution the way it once had. With the black crystal heart, the boundary between life and death had been bent. Elara felt bone-deep frost seep from his hand into her flesh, while the black spot in her chest flared with heat, creating a violent thermal conflict that made her sway. "Julian Thorne is still here," Valerius murmured against her ear, his breath carrying the scent of withered roses and ice. "He is the perfect foundation for my return. He loved you so much that he opened the gates of his soul for me just to save that small, petrifying life of yours. You see it now, Elara? His love is what shackled you both to me." That truth did not comfort her, it crushed her. Julian's sacrifice wasn't salvation, it was the most refined form of agony. He had chosen to become a monster so she could live, and now her life was nothing but eternal servitude to the architect. The emotional shift from horror into a dense, black despair made the verse inside her surge. Black mist threads unfurled from the gem in her palm and wrapped around Valerius's arm. It was the heart of Echoes reacting on instinct, protecting its vessel by binding her even tighter to the thing standing before her. Valerius didn't pull the mist away. He laughed, delighted. "Look at that. Even your soul recognizes its master. We are a perfect triangle now. Julian provides the body, you provide the pulse of life, and I provide the will. Oakhaven is waiting, Elara. It's time to erase those who call themselves keepers of order." He released her chin and turned toward the Citadel's exit. A procession of echoes, white, blurred shadows of dead mages and warriors began to move with his stride. They marched like loyal ghosts, silent, forming a nightmare tableau beneath the borderland's dim, washed-out light. Elara was forced to follow. With every step, she felt her humanity being sanded down. Her sight had become nothing but purples and grays. She no longer saw green grass or gold leaves, only the energy streams of life being siphoned away wherever Valerius passed. They crossed a valley crusted with frost. Valerius stopped beside a lake sealed in ice and gestured for Elara to come closer. "Do you want to see the Covenant's second truth?" he asked without turning. Elara stood beside him in silence. In the ice's dark surface, she saw her reflection. She was no longer the young daughter of House Vance. Her eyes had faded into pale violet, and on her forehead a new verse mark had appeared, the sigil of the vessel. The Covenant's third layer isn't about trading life and death, Valeria said, his voice taking on a thin, thoughtful weight. It is parasitism. For me to maintain Julian's shape in the material world, you will sacrifice a piece of your memory of sensation each day. Today, you will forget warmth. From this moment on, even standing inside a living flame, you will feel only a hollow cold. It happened instantly. A permanent frost fell over Elara's soul. The concept of warmth vanished from her mind like a page burned clean. She knew the sun was rising somewhere. She saw light on her skin, but her mind could no longer decode temperature. The world became an endless block of ice. And in that consequence, Elara understood the bitter truth. Valerius was stripping away the small components that made her human, turning her into a living statue, a pure magical instrument. Stop, she whispered, and her voice no longer sounded like stone grinding, only a terrifying emptiness. Valerius turned. At the sight of pain in her eyes, something in him flickered. Something Julian. A small twitch at the corner of the eye. A hand lifting as if to smooth her hair, then freezing mid-motion. Julian's struggle still existed, buried far beneath Valerius's eyes. I can't stop, Elara. The voice suddenly roughened Julian's pain, breaking through for a single heartbeat. He's too strong. Find a way. Kill me. Then the purple blaze returned, swallowing Julian's presence again. Valerius grabbed her hand and pulled her into his chest, an embrace that was coercion, yet carried a mesmerizing gravity. In Elara's world where warmth no longer existed, Valerius's presence was the only thing she could still feel through the magical bond. Instinctively, she clutched his cloak like someone drowning clings to a drifting iceberg. You see, Valerius smiled, cruel and satisfied. When I take everything from you, I become everything you have. That is the true meaning of the Moonbound Covenant. They continued toward Oakhaven. Behind them, the citadel collapsed into fog, as if it had never existed. Ahead lay the ancient forests encircling the Silver City, where the Iron Veil was gathering its last strength to face the nightmare it had nurtured for centuries through repression and fear. Elara walked in a growing numbness. She watched the Echo army slide by like ink strokes across gray paper. She realized she no longer feared Valerius. Fear requires a self to connect to, and herself was being hollowed out by the hour. In its place, something distorted began to bloom. A slavish loyalty braided with the last residue of love for Julian. Near Oakhaven's border, a patrol of Iron Veil mages appeared. They saw Julian and Elara, saw the ghost army behind them, and drew their weapons in panic. Valerius didn't draw his sword. He simply extended his hand. The black mist threads from the gem in Elara's palm surged forward at his will, piercing through the mages' chests. There was no blood, no scream. The soldiers only stiffened, their eyes draining of light. Then they joined the Echo procession, becoming new puppets of the possessor. Look, Elara, Valerius whispered, his eyes radiant under the moon. This is the new order. No pain, no betrayal, only eternal obedience. Elara stared at the men who had just been empty. She realized she felt no grief, no disgust. A perfect emptiness was taking her over. She looked down at her hand, where the black gem pulsed in flawless synchrony with Valerius's heart. She had become part of the curse,